Right. So far, nearly 1 million people have signed the petition to bring back Jeremy Clarkson. Freedom to fracas, it declares, he says carefully, with a BBC investigation underway about the alleged handbags and pushing. We can't comment. But given the scale of the support for Jeremy Clarkson and the howls of protest at the apparent cancellation of the rest of the series of Top Gear, we ask, has Britain become hostile to blokes? Martin Daubney, former editor of Loaded, he's kind of, he's emblematic, isn't he? He sticks his head above the parapet, he says what he thinks, he does what he likes, and he just gets on with it, and he's a heroic figure for a lot of, not just men, but women, but he kind of cuts that role, doesn't he?
Well, he's an incredibly divisive character. On the one hand, he's greatly admired by his audience. I think it's precisely because he has the balls, frankly, to say what people otherwise are afraid to say.
I'm about to faint.
That makes him incredibly unpopular with his critics, and his critics tend to be the opposite demographic. So we hear a lot of angry, sort of, female voices, and it was interesting this week, I think, how, within 2 days, the same number of people had signed the petition for him to stay than signed the campaign for Page 3 to be dropped from The Sun in 2 years. So this guy is incredibly popular. But on the same hand, he became an interesting thing. He became a magnet, not only for sort of anger about Clarkson in general, but there was so much criticism about the fact that he was white and that he was male. And it's like, wow, what's going on here?
Well, let's take it away from Jeremy, if I may, and just talk about that broader issue and the underlying issue here. Is there a crisis in masculinity with a big M?
Well, we're often told that there is, because that's another sort of stick that's used to beat men. I hear it all the time. What's actually happening is that, being a man has changed radically because how we define ourselves has changed. We no longer do traditional jobs. The stay-at-home mum thing. I was a stay-at-home dad for 6 months, believe it or not, after Loaded. How we be men has changed. But where I'm really worried about all of this is particularly on university campuses. I used to be called the king of the lads, rather embarrassingly. My magazine was a standard bearer for the lad lifestyle, for which I became a great target of malice. Fair enough, it goes with the turf. But young British men, I think, are now being demonised on university campuses because the whole lad culture, the dapper laughs thing, he became this cartoon, caricature version of what a lad is, and he was used to contaminate the entire movement. Now, every young man on university campus who likes to drink and is a bit yobbish...
Banter.
Banter, but where does banter end? Where does it begin? Who knows? We are seeing an incredible suppression of free speech in our universities. In fact, Kate, you yourself were sort of taken off university campus because you're the wrong sort of feminist. Now, I think
I'm not sure that's got anything to do with Dapper Laughs. I think that's utterly...
I think it runs to the heart of the same debate, and that is about the fact that some people find it offensive, millions don't, but the minority of people who find it offensive are controlling what the rest of us are allowed to say or do. It's actually about freedom of speech.
It's about freedom of speech.
Well,
we just hear that.
Jeremy Clarkson is not about freedom of speech. It's about whether there was a fight. It's not. It doesn't matter whether there's a petition.
Let's move on to those who support him and those who feel that their freedom to be curtailed.
Let's talk about this crisis of masculinity or whatever. First of all, is there a war on men? Well, no, there simply isn't, is the answer. If you look at any of the corridors of power, men massively outnumber women in this country and all around the world. But is there, these days, that there's a difference between men, isn't there, and blokes or lads or this kind of culture, which, you're right, is a relatively new thing. 100 years ago, there wasn't this culture of, lad culture. It's a very modern 21st century thing. I actually disagree with that.
I think there were probably lads in the cavemen time. I mean,
but I don't think they were the same. I don't think that it was the same situation that we've got now with sort of like widespread, very violent online pornography, this kind of stuff that is new, and it's a new challenge for people to deal with. And is there, a reaction to that and a backlash against that? Are people... Because I think that actually, you're right, young guys at university, they're being sold this story of like, yay, Jack the lad, drink loads, go out, you're expected to have hundreds of girlfriends and all this kind of stuff. And I think that they're being encouraged sometimes to behave in a way that isn't appropriate. And I think if people are pushing back against that, then that's great news.
There's a backlash, but there's now a backlash, as we can see, against the backlash. This is the point. And, some men feel they're not allowed to be men. I'm just, talk about the banter. When Jeremy Clarkson says, apologies to anyone who's offended by this, when he does a thing on German cars, and he said the navigation systems only go to Poland, there were complaints from... See, Milo liked it. We'll come to Milo in a minute. There were complaints from diplomats. There was outrage in the press. Isn't it just the sort of thing that lads like to say in a bit of banter with their...
I think
the issue is not that bloke behaviour equals the behaviour of all men. That simply isn't true. It's this bullying behaviour that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable in the workplace. It's unacceptable in the media. That is the issue. Freedom of speech, absolutely, I support.
Abdullah, on men in crisis.
I think the problem is that Jeremy Clarkson, why are people bringing in his sex or gender in this? An individual in a workplace had an altercation with his boss. It happens all the time. Why are people focusing on his gender? Isn't that sexist?
Well, there's going to be an inquiry on that. Do you think that roles have become blurred? Do you think that some men feel that they are not allowed to be men anymore in our society in 2015?
I feel that there's a greater stigma on males than there would be on females. Certainly, if you see that if a woman did exactly the same thing as Jeremy Clarkson said, no one would say that. Is there a problem with women today or so on?
So it's kind of tougher for men.
They would view it as very sexist. So the fact that we're okay to bring up Jeremy Clarkson's gender in this shows the problem, that there is an issue, a stigma attached to men. Whenever we do something, it will be reflected in the media as part of our gender.
I'm sorry, speaking as a woman who does stand-up comedy, any time I do a show and something isn't perfect about this show, somebody starts talking about women in comedy. The idea that women are not stigmatised by the actions of individuals within their number is a complete myth.
Milo, what does
to some degree as men?
No,
my point was to the same degree.
More than men. We talk about women in politics and the way they dress. We don't talk about men in politics and the way they dress. The idea that men are specially stigmatised, I'm sorry, but that's a ridiculous...
It's not ridiculous.
The truth is
and it's offensive to say it's ridiculous because, once again, it's just all dismissed. Now, I'm a committee member of the Being a Man Festival at the South Bank Centre, where we are trying to give men an opportunity to be able to talk about things that matter. The biggest killer of men under 45 in the UK is suicide. Now, what's happening? Why is this going on? Right? And I'll tell you why...
But to say...
listen,
but Martin, to
can I talk?
But if you're going to say this is not...
OK, let Martin talk.
What's happening is that the Campaign Against Living Miserably, the charity that represents this, is desperate for more funds to look into why this is going on. But they're not getting it. And I'll tell you why, because men don't qualify as a minority interest, and we don't get preferential funding. Right? You can bet your life, if women start killing themselves, you know, or Muslims did, or black guys, you know, there would be, you know, front-page news, guaranteed government inquiry, millions of pounds of funds. White men are...
Wait a minute. Sally Peck. Let's bring Sally Peck here. I mean, a lot of women are killed in domestic violence, you know, disproportionately, many more. Let Sally speak.
There's a huge problem in this country with gender equality. I mean, as you've seen recently in the global gender gap, we've fallen to 26th place in the world, which is really embarrassing. We used to be 9th place 10 years ago. But the real problem, yes, men have a much higher suicide rate, and that's because we tell children when they're 1 year old that boys and girls are different. And this causes boys to grow up without any emotional intelligence. People think, oh yeah, we need gender equality because this will get girls into STEM subjects, which is true. But even more important than that, we need gender equality so that boys won't be violent. There's a wonderful charity based in Edinburgh called Zero Tolerance, which is teaching gender equality to childminders, so that they can teach children that they're equal, they have equal opportunities, and they do it specifically to reduce violence from men to women when they're adults. We need to start much earlier than men.
OK, Milo, you want to come in?
Unbelievable, astonishing sexism. We have to teach young boys not to be boys so they won't be violent.
Why is being violent being...
Get out! Get out! I'm sorry. Like, gender... we teach boys and girls that they're the same, and that's a problem. They are different. When we do experiments on young babies and even on related animals, we know that certain children go for certain toys. Boys and girls are different. To give you some context for all of this, you have to understand a little bit about the history of feminism. There have been two main strands.
And here is our local expert.
Well, of course, because of course men aren't allowed to speak about anything that isn't to do with men, except no one's really interested in.
Already said indicate that you know nothing about it.
All right. Well, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the problems that men are experiencing in society. And since you're not a man, perhaps you could like to give it a rest for a second. So there is a wider context in which men are suffering slightly. Even 10 years ago it would have been ridiculous to say it. But very recently, we've seen a lot of structural advantages to being a woman. crop up in education, in the workplace. Under 30, women earn more than men for the same work in the UK and the US now, which is an extraordinary statistic and something that people have to be very, very carefully convinced of because it sounds absurd. But there is a sense in which men, particularly young men, probably men our age, haven't necessarily experienced it, but younger men, 20-year-olds, there's an enormous problem. I read about this last year. I call it the sexodus, of men checking out of society, checking out of relationships, giving up on women, giving up on careers. They don't bother to go to university anymore. Now more women go to university, women get higher grades at university, more women graduate from university. Yep. All of the traditional imbalances between men and women have flipped, and very recently.
No, that's
and when
incorrect,
young men,
when you go
may I be allowed to finish?
Business,
Sorry, I'm talking about men, darling. And
you call them darling? How incredibly rude. And now you think it's funny. Well, this is exactly the problem. This is institutionalised sexism, and you're just sitting here doing it flagrantly and without even apologising.
Well, we just heard that it was an essential characteristic of men that they were violent a minute ago. So
no,
I guess
we did not.
That's exactly what you said.
Nobody said that.
My point is...
Anyway, wait, I'm getting out of here. I'll tell you. No,
so I'm tempted to come with you, Nick.
If anyone in the audience wants to say something, please feel free to put up your hand, and I'll bring you in at this stage. And just for the sake of diplomacy, let me take it to you, Christine, and then you, Jane.
Thank you.
Christine, men still boss the world, don't they?
In terms of, well, I agree with the gentleman that there are huge demographic changes taking place. 60% of graduates in the UK are female. 25% of main breadwinners, working moms are breadwinners. A further 16% have the same earning capacity as or earnings as their partner. That is true. 10% of working dads now stay at home. They've left the workforce. We also have millennials and Gen Y who want more personal time. I really do empathize with the changes that are happening and how that must feel, but it's happening across society.
Let me ask you as well, what about the boardrooms, which you know very well? Are they still, you know, what was that programme, Mad Men, you know, that kind of testosterone-fueled environment, the figuratively smoke-filled rooms and the swaggering about and the banging of machismo on the table? Is it still like that, or is it changing?
It's changing, but it's at the beginning. In the UK, we're aiming for 25% for the top 250 companies to have 25% of the board members be female, but we are at the beginning of that journey. And when I say at the beginning, when you look at the next level under that, the executive committee, it's still less than 20% are female. So we have a long way to go in terms of gender equality in business.
Jane, as somebody who lived in the wrong body for a lot of years and lived as a man, you were kind of undercover in the other world, weren't you?
I was going to say maybe I can come in as a fifth column. I'm fascinated listening to Martin and Milo go on about this. Without getting into the existential, what does one count as, what I know is that I counted, as far as the public was concerned, as male, and then later I didn't count as male. And what I've experienced is the fear of going out and about on the streets, and men don't know they're born. They don't understand that fear. They don't understand the parking close to a station, carrying your keys in case somebody might come up to you. They don't understand, a friend of mine, 20 years in IT, trans woman, and she is now asked to make the tea, although she's a senior consultant in the room. So we see this all the time. What is going on here is men don't know how privileged they are, and it's a little bit, sadly, like my sister who grew up in a world without word processing, and now she has to do word processing. She really doesn't like it, and that's sad, and I'm sorry, but you have to move on. But men have had privilege, men have had privilege, and now they don't have so much. I'm sorry.
May I just ask you this question? Do you think that perhaps your experience as somebody who's transitioned from male to female might be part of your experiences too? I mean, you're sort of claiming experiences now as a woman.
No, I'm not doing that.
Well, that's what you said. You said your experience changed as...
No, I very carefully said, because then you get very existential about what do I count as. I said I've experienced life wearing the male garb and not wearing the male garb. And the point is that wearing the male garb, you get away with murder.
Martin?
I think, your situation, heartfelt, this is a new thing, the transgender thing. A lot of men are confused about what that means. What I mean by that is, there's a lot of change. We need to get used to that. Dead right, absolutely. But we must never forget that the vast majority of people who are attacked or murdered in the UK or around the world are actually men. OK, other men are doing that. You know, it's a male-on-male thing. And that's another sort of reason to prove that men are toxic, because we're killers. And that's what the message we hear all the time is about the terrible things men do. What about the great things men can do? When do we ever hear about that? Where are the surveys to prove men are good? There's a survey out this week saying that if you smile at a woman, you're sexist. This got global media pickup. It's ridiculous. It's like everything we do is sexist, conniving, and part of some great...
Milo. Successes. I mean, of course, the great feminist academic Camille Paglia said if women around the world, we'd all be still living in grass huts. You know, we know what men have done. Men have got us to the moon. Men built the pyramids. Men built the internet. Men did lots of wonderful things. But you're right that, you know, what we tend to hear a lot is that that what men bring to society is this sort of toxic masculinity, which was alluded to earlier, and all these other sort of ridiculous offences. It's now open season, particularly if you're white and you're a man, and what feminists don't seem to appreciate the irony of is that they are relentlessly ridiculing people on the basis of skin colour and sex, and they don't seem to get the irony there.
In a second, let's Sally first.
Well, I just think that you're completely misinterpreting the situation here. And with the issue of violence, we're talking about male and male violence. What I'm talking about with early childhood education is giving all of the possibilities to all children.
Not saying here are the pink toys for you, here are the toy soldiers for you. So how does it
work?
Like
let toys be toys. Well, I mean, many studies have shown that when they're babies, if a baby cries, a girl child will be picked up much more quickly and held and comforted for much longer. She's taught by her closeness to her carer that her feelings count, they matter, and she gets a reaction. Whereas boys, in every study, it shows they're encouraged to play further away, they're not picked up as quickly, they're not comforted. So it's
not, you're going to be a princess and you're going to be a superhero.
Yes, that's what it turns into. But even earlier than that, that's my point.
Yeah.
Boys' emotions are not listened to, and this is what causes the problems. Boys, there's not a toxic, natural masculinity. It's not the nature. We are teaching them to do that.
Teaching boys to be toxic.
To care.
You see, the problem is that this sort of view leads to absurdities we now have in the education system. In the US, for example, where boys are judged to this sort of emotional, sort of feminine standard, where we've all got to be sort of emotive and talk about our feelings. The consequences of that is 1 in 5 American boys put on Ritalin because they're boisterous in class, because they're held up to this sort of touchy-feely feminine standard that isn't how boys behave. And what happens is we end up with a generation of drugged-up young boys. And if you look at the statistics, the number of kids that are on Adderall and Ritalin, whatever, in the United States, and it's beginning to happen here, it's monstrous, and it comes from this sort of philosophy.
First of all, feminists did not invent the global big pharma industry. I mean, that's just ridiculous. But secondly, I think you're really confusing what feminists are saying. I think you're really failing to listen. When feminists are talking about masculinity and the way that, what I'm not saying is men are innately evil and awful. What I'm saying is that we live in a rather toxic culture where men are raised and told that they should be competitive and aggressive and detached from their emotions. And actually, this is wrong, and this is not doing men any favours or women any favours, and it ties in directly to the mental health issues that Martin is talking about with young men, and it ties in directly to the women being brutally murdered by their partners every week in Britain. And that's what we're challenging. It's not about attacking men, it's about challenging the culture that men are being dragged into and saying, you don't have to be a part of that, there are much better options for men.
Lynn, I told you wanted to come in as we come towards the end. Of course, we've got to remember it's not just some women who are attacking sort of blokish blokes. Some blokish blokes feel some men are attacking them as well, and so on and so forth. Make your quick point.
Yes, no, it's interesting, isn't it? You said you were a stay-at-home dad for a while.
Yours is the last point, by the way.
Yes, indeed. While stay-at-home fathers are actually seen as progressive in this society, hey, you're a stay-at-home dad, aren't you brilliant? Aren't you amazing? Aren't you doing a wonderful job? Yet if you're a stay-at-home mother, you're retrograde. According to Nick Clegg, we're in an Edwardian society. They're harping back to the Edwardian days. We're in rose sepia-tinted glasses just because you're a mother. So where's that? That's sexist.
That's all we have time for on that. And I think you brilliantly